Order. Drew Henry to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Paisley, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Before I start the debate this morning, can I thank the Minister for having taken the time out prior to this debate. I believe it's a refreshing departure from the way many of our government colleagues work to engage beforehand, and I thank her for it and the way she goes about her business with this. We'll see, of course, when it comes to her remarks, whether she can agree to the change that's so desperately needed. So let's get something straight right from the beginning. Energy policy is 100% reserved to the UK Government. I will later come to the actions of the Scottish Government on the cost of living and our attempts to mitigate UK Government harms, but let's be clear, the issue we're discussing here today lies squarely at the feet of the UK Government and the regulator Ofgem. Now, the energy market in its current form is completely broken, and along with colleagues, I've been calling for urgent changes to the whole system and urgent support for those in need. The reintroduction of a £400 energy bill rebate, for regressive standing charges to be abolished, for the Chancellor to honour his pledge of opening a consultation on the social tariff. This debate, however, is about a specific action for the people of the Highlands and Islands, who are uniquely disadvantaged, and of a workable solution for them. I'm going to underline how the people of the Highlands and Islands have been neglected by both the regulator and the UK Government, and how energy injustice has not levelled up, but has simply and rapidly increased, and why now is the time, and of course, how the Government can fix it. Part of the problem in preparing for a debate like this is that the message is so straightforward. The injustice is so clear and unarguable that it feels almost surreal. How has this been allowed to get to where it is? And why hasn't this already been fixed? Of course, we should know that the Highlands and Islands are largely rural, almost entirely off gas grid, so rely on higher electricity use, fuel oil and LPG, much more expensive than for those, the majority across the nations of the UK, who are on the gas grid. We have a colder climate, sometimes spectacularly so. As a result of these factors, we use more units of electricity and pay more than the UK average. Higher electricity bills just to get through the days. What this means then is that more of our people live in fuel poverty, around a third overall and around a fifth in extreme fuel poverty. By far the highest across the nations of the UK. And now, you would think, Mr. Paisley, that these facts alone would have spurred any government in power to do so with a spare ounce of conscience to look at meaningful interventions to help. But that hasn't happened. Of course, fuel poverty is a major driver of actual poverty. And when the time comes that you can't switch the heating on, and that's a lived experience, by the way, for many, other problems click in. Some are already barely eating due to the punishing cost of living and simply try to endure the cold. Some go to more extreme measures, as we know, such as self-disconnection. This all has depressingly obvious consequences. As the medical journal The Lancet pointed out, when people can no longer heat their homes, their mental health deteriorates significantly, and their odds of reporting depression, anxiety or hypertension increases by around 50%, as does the risk of suicide. For children in cold homes, there are increased risk of asthma attacks and respiratory infections, and as the temperature drops and the circulation of viruses increases, and immunity is impaired. An absolutely avoidable public health dereliction continues whilst this remains unaddressed. So you'd think any government with the power to do so, any shred of decency, would act in these circumstances. Instead, it's been allowed to get worse. We've long been arguing these points, but the kick in the teeth to the people in the Highlands and Islands is the standing charge for electricity. The standing charge is a pernicious beast to those suffering real poverty and fuel poverty because it applies every single day, warm or cold, heating on or off. The consumer cannot control it. There are no measures they can take. So what have the UK government allowed Ofgem, their regulator, to do across the Highlands and Islands, who were already paying 40% more for their standing charge than those living here in London? They've let them increase it to 50% more than those living in London. According to your weather, the average mean daily temperature in London, the warmest city in the UK, is 16 degrees Celsius. In Skye, it's 9 degrees Celsius. How can this be fair? Surely any government with the power to do something about this and a shred of decency would. But if all of this wasn't unfair enough, think about this. Those families across the Highlands and Islands suffering these unfair charges, leading to fuel poverty and even extreme fuel poverty, those frightened of the bills if they turn the heating on, terrified of the envelope with the bill, trying to feed and warm their kids, they are sitting in the middle of an energy wealth much, much bigger than their needs, and they get none of it paid back to them. They can see the infrastructure all around them as renewable energy is generating, and it's higher, but let's go on the low side, at least 6 times more than the electricity that they use. The rest is exported to the grid, only to be sold back to them at the costs I've described. It's immoral. The UK government has the power to do something about it and must now make amends for this grossly unfair situation. Now, the Minister will say that our hands are tied because Ofgem makes these decisions. Ofgem will say that their hands are tied because they need instruction from the government. I don't believe anybody suffering these conditions in the Highlands and Islands will take that argument from the Minister when we hear it, and maybe she'll adjust her notes before we get to that point later on, but we'll see. When it comes to mitigating Westminster policies that increase poverty in the Highlands and Islands, the Scottish Government, although it shouldn't have to, has been doing what it can, paying the bedroom tax, for example, so that our people don't have to, supporting those children I mentioned through the Scottish Child Payment, putting money in place to fund a council tax freeze. But it doesn't have the power over energy. The UK government has. The same UK government that introduced the 2-child limit, the rate clause, cut universal credit by £20 a week, reduced funding for public services in their last autumn statement by £19 billion, severely restricting devolved government and local authority support. Now, I started with some praise for the Minister and her engagement prior to the debate, and the Minister told me that she would like some figures, so I have some for her. Northern Scotland, as it's called, under Ofgem, pays more for both standing charges and unit rates than the UK average, 60.1p and 24.5p respectively. Currently, Northern Scotland's standing charge cost is 59.38p, roughly 50% higher, as I mentioned, than London. Energy usage in the Highlands and Islands averages over 4,400 kilowatts per household, compared to around 3,000 kilowatts in London. 62% of the properties in the Highlands and Islands are not connected to the gas grid, resulting in higher heating costs per household. On current rates, the daily standing charges direct debit single rate April to June 2024 for Northern Scotland for electricity is 61.1 pence in Northern Scotland, 40.79 pence in London. The daily standing charges direct debit multi-rate April to June 2024, Northern Scotland 62.25 pence, electricity 40.75 pence. On fuel poverty, 2021 rates of fuel poverty are thought to be underestimates because of COVID restrictions, and the Commons Library uses 2017 to 2019 aggregates. But the Highlands and Islands region has the highest levels of fuel poverty and extreme fuel poverty in the UK. 39.8%, some 5,000 households in the Highland and Islands Shire, 24.3% extreme poverty. 32.9% households in the Highlands, 21.5% extreme poverty. 32.2% of households in Argyll and Bute, 19% extreme poverty. 31.6% of households in Murray, 18.5% extreme poverty. 30.9% of households in the Shetland Islands, 22% extreme poverty, and 30.5% of households in Orkney Islands, 22% in extreme poverty. Now, the Minister will no doubt, and I expect her to point to the Hydro Benefit Replacement Scheme as help to balance the situation out. But knowing she will have done her research, I think she knows that this is a poor substitute and excuse for years of inactivity. A Bayes report in 2022 notes that the HBRS does not and never could provide an efficient or effective way of providing targeted support to a specific group of vulnerable consumers within a region. It does, however, Mr. Paisley, in its own unique and inadequate way, point to a solution, along with another precedent that's come up recently that could be adopted, which I will come to very shortly. The Hydro Benefit Replacement Scheme was established in the 1940s to compensate for the small hydro dams, and it took current form in 2005 under the Energy Act 2004. But as it stands, as I've said, it falls woefully short of the meaningful intervention required. In 2022, the Highlands and Islands Housing Association's Affordable Warmth Group highlighted the £60 per annum discount is only, and I quote, adding insult to injury to regional energy costs. When you're paying much more than the rest, it doesn't really make a difference. When you're producing much more electricity than you can ever use, already in 2022, Scotland is producing the equivalent of 113% of Scotland's overall electricity consumption from renewable technologies, a 26-point increase compared to 2021. And as I've said earlier, the figure I'm absolutely certain is on the low side. The Highlands produces enough energy to power 6 times as many homes as there are in the Highlands through electricity. The Highlands produced a total of 7.2 million megawatts of energy, with 4 million megawatts of energy from offshore wind and almost 3 million megawatts from hydropower. Argyll and Bute produced 1.3 megawatts of energy from renewable sources. The Highland Council area comprises only 0.36% of the UK total population, yet the area produces 5.5% of the 49.7 gigawatt UK installed capacity for renewables. 43% of the UK's installed hydro capacity and 13% of the UK's installed onshore wind capacity. With these regions playing a crucial role in providing the rest of the UK with cheap energy, it is only right, surely, that it starts to get some benefit from cheaper energy prices, and yet it's not. Now, the Hydro Replacement Benefit Scheme could and should be converted into something more meaningful. Now, the Chancellor, during his autumn statement, offered the solution himself. He said, why not introduce a meaningful rate based on compensating our Highlands and Islands contributions? He said in his autumn statement that he would introduce a rebate of up to £1,000 a year for up to 10 years for people living next to planned new energy generation infrastructure. That's very laudable. So if it works for those living next to new generation equipment, how about those living amongst existing current generation equipment? This rebate would redistribute the wealth being generated in the Highlands and Islands amongst the community, enabling these communities to reap benefits from that which is produced in their communities, offering several benefits. Reduced energy costs for those facing higher than average per unit costs, alleviating the financial pressure this places on households. It would empower communities by allowing them to reap the benefits of what their communities produce, and boost economic growth by alleviating the pressure on households from energy costs. Yes, I will give way.
Mr. Paisley, the honourable member is making an excellent speech, which I think strikes a chord with anybody who knows and works for the Highlands. There is another benefit, I think. During COVID, it was a fact that the warmth of anyone who was suffering from COVID, their recovery was assisted by being kept warm. And I believe that in terms of disease prevention, a warm household goes a very long way towards that. So I think it's arguable that one of the benefits of getting this right would be the health of people in the Highlands, which would lead to less days off work and greater economic productivity, which can only be good for the economy of the Highlands.
I thank the honourable member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross for his intervention, and you won't be surprised to hear that I agree. Indeed, I mentioned earlier in the speech that the Lancet have reported on the health outcomes that that come from having a house that's too cold, and one of them is the fact that immunity drops and that people's resistance to picking up infections actually increases due to those circumstances, and particularly on the effects on children and their own ability to develop. But he makes a very good point about the fact that this is not only an issue of lost work days, but lost ability for people to operate in their communities and indeed have a general sense of well-being. So he's absolutely right to highlight that point, and I thank him for it. He talked about economic growth, and as I said, it would boost economic growth by alleviating the pressure on households from energy costs, allowing them some money to try and get through the cost of living and spend it elsewhere. So let's see some justice and some amends made for the suffering to those in fuel poverty who are generating and exporting the power for others across the nations of the UK. The Highlands and Islands produces almost 6% of UK energy, while having about 0.4% of the population. So why do we not benefit further from this? We pay higher than average bills, face higher bill costs due to the climate, have higher rates of fuel poverty and extreme fuel poverty, yet live in an energy-rich region. Even the UK Government's own report, as I mentioned, the Bayes Review Scheme of 2022, describes how the Hydro Benefit Replacement Scheme does not provide efficient or effective support for vulnerable consumers in specific regions. And the scheme introduced by the Chancellor that will give rebates to those living near new energy infrastructure up to the tune of £10,000 over 10 years is laudable. So why can't a scheme be put in place for those living near to existing renewable infrastructure? It's time for the people of the Highlands and Islands to be treated fairly, to end the fuel poverty and to be recognised for their contribution to the billions generated for the Treasury on their doorsteps. It's time for a Highland energy rebate. Thank you.
That helps me considerably. The question is that the House has considered the introduction of energy rebates for the Highlands and Islands. Alistair Carmichael.
Mr Paisley, it's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I very warmly congratulate the honourable member for Inverness for acquiring this time for a debate on a subject that matters to his constituents, my constituents, my honourable friend and his right honourable friend's constituents, because, as he says, this is an issue that goes right across the Highlands and Islands. In the Highlands and Islands, we have longer, darker, colder winters. We have more houses that are older and therefore more difficult to insulate and to heat. And of course, we have virtually no access to the gas grid. And these are all things that contribute to the perfect storm that the honourable member very rightly outlined there, and that is the exceptionally high incidence of fuel poverty. I know that because it's one of the less laudable claims to fame that the Northern Isles has, is that we have the highest rates of fuel poverty, along with the Western Isles, in the Highland and in Year, than anywhere else in the country. Well, can we right on here?
I'm very grateful to the right honourable member. Much is often said about the colder temperatures that we have in the Highlands and the dark winters that we have, but we also need to give consideration. It's not just about temperature. It's about the driving wind and the rain that makes it feel colder. I mean, there are times that the rain is horizontal, certainly in the places like the Isle of Skye and other parts. And let's remember that these communities are often very isolated. You're talking about single homes. There's very little protection which is provided. So the impact of bad weather on cold weather, on windy weather, on wet weather is enormous on these communities, and that just increases the need to have the heating on to give some protection from the climate.
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. Of course, we have to be a little bit careful about how we describe this to people in other parts of the world, because doubtless in a week or two we'll all be back here telling everybody that they should come and have their holidays in the Highlands and Islands. But yes, we are by no means unfamiliar with the phenomenon of that, of the rain that comes straight at you, and certainly. I think it's always the surest sign of somebody who has just recently moved to Orkney or Shetland or is visiting that on a rainy day they go out with an umbrella, a spectacularly useless piece of equipment in the communities that we are blessed to call home. So, look, the honourable gentleman from Inverness brings a very interesting and constructive proposal in terms of an energy or a standing charge rebate. And when it comes to the question of energy costs, I have long taken the view that every little helps. You know, frankly, it doesn't really matter whether it's a silver bullet or not, but when families are facing that choice, not heating and eating, but starving and freezing, is probably a better characterisation for it in the Highlands and Islands. Then, you know, if there is some benefit to be had, then we should take it. That was very much the view I took in relation to the alternative fuel payment that the government came forward with last year. It did help a bit, and a bit of help is better than nothing. I think, though, the honourable gentleman would probably agree that standing charges are a small part of the equation when it comes to the question of energy costs and the actual cost that it involves to heat your home. And that's really where the real action is to be found in the unit price. And, you know, it's on that unit price that I think I would like to focus some attention, because not least Ofgem are, as I understand it, carrying out a consultation in relation to a social tariff. Social tariff is an interesting idea, and it's one that I think it would command a fair degree of support across the whole House. So I hope they get on with it, and they get on with it quickly. And within that social tariff, there has to be some mechanism, surely, for geographical variation, because social is not just on the basis of income. It has to bring in other factors as well, such as the fact that we live in places that have longer, darker, colder winters.
Grateful to the honourable member for Orkney and Shetland for giving way, and you know, he's right to talk about this as being a wider package. I brought the debate today to be specific about this need, but that doesn't negate the sense of what he's saying about the collective impact of this. And yes, with the social tariff, perhaps the Highland Energy Rebate Scheme actually gives an opportunity to put that geographical difference in, to allow that into the mix to achieve the aim that he's after. Well,
I mean, it's the case certainly in Shetland that Shetland Islands Council for years has promoted the idea of a Shetland tariff. And, you know, I very much understand what the honourable gentleman says about seeing the energy development. This is something that we've lived with in Shetland and in Orkney for the last 50 years, as we have kept the rest of you supplied with hydrocarbons, Mr Paisley. And, you know, we've had some significant benefit, but nothing, I think, compared to what we could have had. So, yes, there are opportunities here. I think the real fight comes in relation to the energy unit cost, and but in the meantime, if we can do something with standing charges, then that's absolutely what we should be doing. I'm a wee bit disappointed that we've not got a better turnout for the debate this morning, I'll be honest, because it seems to me that actually what the honourable gentleman has drawn our attention to here is something that is really severe for the Highlands and Islands, but it's not only severe for the Highlands and Islands. The honourable gentleman referred to the disparity between a standing charge in London and that in the Highlands and Islands, now, or North Scotland, which I think is probably the same thing. In London, for somebody paying their bill by direct debit, the current standing charge is 38.5 pence per day. against the North of Scotland figure, which is 59.38 pence per day, and the South of Scotland figure, which is 62.08 pence per day. Utterly random, Mr. Paisley. You know, I'm sure that there has probably been some very clever and complicated set of sums done to get these figures, but they have produced what, in the Highlands and Islands and elsewhere in Scotland, we would probably just call mince. Because if ever it was an illustration of the fact that the regulation of the energy market has gone wrong in a fundamental way and requires root and branch reform, then this is surely it. In North Wales and Mersey, the rate per day is now 62.21 pence per day, so even higher, actually, than the Highlands and Islands and the southern Scotland. And they are paying 29.57 pence per unit, compared to 28.48 pence per day in North Scotland and 28.16 pence per day in southern Scotland. The other injustice, when you drill down into the figures and the way in which the market has been regulated, is that when it comes to prepayment meters, so these are people who, by definition, are going to be under the greatest financial pressures when it comes to paying for their energy. The rate charged for the Highlands and Islands is 62.3 pence per day in standing charges and 27.19 pence per kilowatt hour. That again, so if you're paying by direct debit, I suspect probably everybody else in the room at the moment does. In the north of Scotland, you're paying 59.38 pence per day, whereas if you are somebody who has found themselves in a situation where they're having to rely on a prepayment meter, then that same figure is 66.23 pence per day. In what universe can that possibly be seen as a system that is sensible and fair? Of course.
The honourable member is making an excellent speech. It seems to me that he talks about an injustice, but when the National Health Service was set up, it meant that whether you lived in Lerwick, or you lived in Tain, or you lived in Paisley, or in Bristol, you had the same right to be seeing a doctor, getting an antibiotic, getting a treatment to make you well. And it seems to me that it's basically, this flies in the face of a notion of fairness. That is actually something rather important to our democracy.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman because, in fact, he does make a very important point here. He touched earlier, as did the honourable gentleman from Inverness, on the health aspects of this. And, you know, when it comes to energy costs, this is not just something that impacts the family budget for heating the house. This has much wider application. It does, as the honourable gentleman from Inverness said, impact your mental health. It does also have serious impacts for those who are elderly and more vulnerable to the cold as a consequence of that, and who have physical health conditions. And these are the people for whom that choice between heating and eating actually becomes a less difficult one to make, but only in a bad way, because they have no choice. They have to give priority to heating because of their medical condition. So the fact that we have now gone so far from this idea of energy costs being provided on a universal basis, essentially on the idea of there being a universal price, a standard price across the whole country, I think shows just how badly wrong the regulation of this market has gone. And really, as the honourable gentleman from Inverness has said, this is something where the responsibility does lie at the door of Ofgem. I wish we could see a bit more proactivity from them. They had to be taken kicking and squealing to get to the point of consulting in relation to a social tariff. So if there is a capacity within the Minister's responsibility to offer them an instruction to look at this and to achieve the meaningful change, then I think she does have the opportunity to do some genuinely good work here. So, in conclusion, Mr Paisley, I congratulate the honourable gentleman for focusing our attention on the question of standing charges. It is bad for the Highlands and Islands. It is even worse, it seems, for other parts of the country, albeit maybe some other parts that are not going to be as heavily dependent on heat in the winter as we are. Of course, I couldn't sit down, though, without making brief reference to the fact that for many people in our constituencies, the real cost for them in relation to heating their houses comes from the cost of heating oil, because that's the only way in which they can heat their houses. And in relation to that, there are no standing charges, and it's much more difficult to get money into the pockets of people who rely on that. But that is something that is baked into the system, and it's not going to be fixed easily, of course.
Grateful, I realise he's concluded his speech, but I think it is important to point out that this is an issue that I and others, and possibly even himself, has raised in the past, that Ofgem have been delinquent in not regulating for those off the gas grid as well. And there is a need to appreciate those people who are reliant on LPG and fuel oil do need some protection as well. But again, you know, when they are using fuel oil and LPG, they also tend to rely on using more electricity, which brings us back to the main thrust. I thank him for his patience.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and you would expect there's not a great deal of difference. The one thing where I think, if I were in Ofgem, I would start is looking at the question of multi-rate meters, things like Economy 7 and that, of course, total heating with total control, which many of our constituents use. In relation to them, the standing charges in the northern Scotland are 69.32 pence, and in southern Scotland 69.17 pence per day. Again, you see the disparity. Now, that's one standing charge where actually direct action could have a very direct impact on the Highlands and Islands. So I shall await to hear with interest what the Minister has to say. I agree with the experience of the honourable gentleman from Inverness. The Minister is somebody who is thoughtful and prepared to engage, and I hope that, having had this brought to her attention, she will use her offices to ensure that going ahead, the position in the Highlands and Islands, and for those who are fuel poor in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and indeed Southern Scotland as well, will not be given this rather shoddy treatment.
Thank you. Scottish National Party spokesperson, Ian Black.
Thank you, Mr Paisley. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And let me thank the honourable member for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey in securing this important debate, the contribution that he has made and the absolute urgent need of getting recompense for those that live in the Highlands and Islands, and indeed the remarks made by my honourable friend from Orkney and Shetland as well. Let me, if I may, put this in a slightly broader context, because we stand on the cusp of an energy production revolution. David Skirring, in his 2022 report, The Economic Opportunity for Scotland from Renewable Energy and Green Technology, talks of a potential five-fold increase in green energy production from the then 12 gigawatts to 80 gigawatts by 2050, transforming the landscape in Scotland, and of course the economic opportunity that there is there for investment and for jobs as well. Scotland, therefore, playing its part through green energy production, and also to play our part to deliver on climate change, to deliver on net zero. Energy-rich Scotland being the powerhouse of green energy production, with the Highlands and Islands being a key driver in that increased production both onshore and offshore. A green energy bonanza driving investment and financial returns for investment who will benefit from what is, after all, our natural resources. But, Mr Paisley, there has to be fairness and there has to be equity for those that live in the Highlands and Islands. There is the expression spoken originally in Gaelic for many generations of Gaels that you do not own the land, you belong to the land. And that sense of responsibility that comes from that, to look after the land and protect it, to use opportunities wisely. That the Highlands and Islands is a source of green energy production we can take pride in. But what does it mean for those that live there? And that harsh reality, as has been outlined, that so many living in the Highlands and Islands are living in fuel poverty. And if you think about it, if you live in that region, you can see the energy production. You can see the transmission lines exporting energy, whilst too many are facing fuel poverty. Mr. Paisley, that is a disgrace. And let us examine the facts. Even before the spiralling costs of energy over the last 2 years, many households, too many households in the Highlands and Islands were already living in fuel poverty. Indeed, in 2022, it's estimated that 31% of Scottish households were in fuel poverty, where an extraordinary 18.5% were already in extreme fuel poverty. That was before the energy price increases we've seen over the course of the last couple of years. When we look at rural households, the fuel poverty rate was 35%, and for remote rural areas, it's a staggering 47%. Nearly half of all households in the rural parts of the Highlands and Islands living in fuel poverty. We're supposed to be a civilised society. Compassion is supposed to be at our core. How can it be right? How can we tolerate that so many of our citizens are living in fuel poverty? And my own constituency of Roscoe and Lochaber is largely a remote rural constituency. We've talked about the impact of weather, not just on temperature, but of the wind and the rain. And think about that. Yes, of course, we can enjoy and we encourage people to come and visit our beautiful areas in the summer. But think about having to endure a Highland winter, that driving wind and rain. And, Mr. Chairman, many people simply can't afford to turn the heating on, given the costs that they face. And let's not forget, much of this is a political choice. Much has been said about the standing charge. But if you look at the increase in standing charge in Scotland since 2022, it's increased by 138%. How on earth can anyone, how can the government, how can the minister justify such an increase at a time that so many people are suffering from the cost of living? How can anyone look at my constituents in the eye and tell them that it's right that we should be increasing the standing charge by 138%? Mr. Paisley, today we've got the budget. We've got the Tories fixating about tax cuts. Tax cuts. My goodness. I'll tell you what people in the Highlands and Islands want. They want help with their energy bills. They want the ability to be able to turn the heating on. They want the ability to put food on the table. And what a distraction this Tory fixation with tax cuts is. Let's deal with the fundamentals of this. And, you know, when we come back to what's happened with the standing charge, because let's be clear, consumers are being ripped off in the middle of a cost of living crisis by a policy decision that heaps costs on those that face difficult choices as to whether they can turn their heating on. But, of course, whether you can turn your heating on or not, you still have to pay that standing charge. You still have to pay that daily bill. Where is the fairness? Where is the equity? But not only that, in the Highlands and Islands, we get penalised by higher transmission and distribution charges. That is, after all, a financial penalty imposed on people that live in the Highlands and Islands by this government. That's what it is. No ifs, no buts. It's a charge for living in the area that many people were brought up in. And yet, when those that live in their houses that are having to consider where to put the heating on, they can look out the windows, they can see the wind turbines, they can see the transmission lines. What kind of country do we live in where we allow this to happen? As has been mentioned by my honourable friend, the vast Highland Council area has 0.36% of the UK's population. yet we produce 5.5% of the UK's installed capacity for renewable energy. Where is the direct benefit for communities on producing energy that the rest of us in the other parts of the United Kingdom benefit on? Why is it not mandatory in legislation that compensation is paid by producers to local communities who they need the right of consent in order to produce? Come back to that point about you don't own the land, you belong to the land. There ought to be that commitment written into legislation that the communities that are affected by this benefit. Why is it not mandatory that the transmission companies recognise the rights of communities to benefit from composition from the rights of transmission? I want companies to invest in the Highlands and Islands. I want companies to come and invest, to prosper and to be part of our future. I want the Highlands and Islands to be at the forefront of green energy production. I want investment in green energy to lead to a green industrial renaissance for the Highlands, but I want fairness for our communities. The Chancellor has talked about those living near transmission lines benefiting for up to £1,000 off their energy bills for a decade. Why has this not yet happened? That much-needed investment in the national grid to meet the increase in energy production is with us now. It is very much a live issue in the constituency that I represent. To a greater extent, Scottish and Southern Energy is at the forefront of much of this investment. And I stress that we should all work with companies like SSE, who I know share a vision of a just energy transition for the Highlands and Islands. I want to see that economic renaissance in the Highlands. And I recognise the scale of investment that SSE will be making over the coming years in transmission and production, not least in the Corrie Glass pump storage scheme. There is, in essence, a £20 billion investment programme for the north of Scotland, and it's important that we get the legacy in terms of jobs and wider infrastructure improvements. £20 billion just from SSE. Just think about that, and think about what should be a modest, because that's all we're asking for, community benefit for this. If we look at something like Corrie Glass, and let me just expand on this a bit, there are likely to be 500 full-time jobs in the construction. And this will require housing for the workforce. And it is vital that such projects can have a lasting legacy and investment in housing, which is so critical for the future of the Highlands, linking what happens in energy policy to our industrial development and needs for homes. But we also need the offer of financial compensation right now for our communities. Mr. Chairman, if we can greenlight the much-needed investment, where is the benefit for those affected, and where is the recompense for those that have existing transmission lines, a point that was made by my honourable friend? But I'll happily give way.
He's making clear points about the fact that as generation is happening, the people of the Highlands and Islands are losing out. And as I underlined in my speech, that's it's a direct slap in the face when you look at the situations that they have to endure. But there's also the matter of the electricity generation levy, which is also deducted from those generating electricity in the Highlands. It goes straight to the Treasury. Another fund that could be used to pay some of that money back to the people who are generating.
No, I mean, it's a very important and very fair point that he makes. And in my own constituency, in my own home island of the Isle of Skye, there are a number of planning applications which are coming forward. And of course, there are always a range of views on these things across all of our communities. But if I look back over the last few years, and indeed the debate which is taking place today, on balance, people in general are favourably disposed towards these developments. They understand the importance of getting to net zero. My goodness, and the communities that we all represent, we feel the impact of climate change. We can see it. But there has to be that fairness. And the fact that so many people are living in fuel poverty, the 47% of households that I referred to that live in the rural areas. And you can see it when you're out and about. I mean, if you think about us here in London, going about our job, many people dressed as we are in our working garb and suits or whatever else it might be. But when you see people in these remote rural areas, often working outdoors, working in the fishing industry, working as crofters or farmers. It's largely an outdoor life to a large extent. And you can see people with layers of clothes. They need the layers of clothes because of the climate that they're facing outside. But, and here's the but, too many cases they're still wearing these layers of clothes when they come back inside because they simply can't afford the heating. That's the reality. And when we give our consent, because it is about us giving our consent to that increase in energy production, where's the benefit? Because, I talked about that increase in energy production that we're going to see in Scotland between now and 2050, and we welcome it. But how can we have our people living in fuel poverty? How can we accept that? Where is the fairness? And that, I will in just 1 second, I'll just, on this point. We're being charged higher transmission costs to transmit that energy into the grid. And we're then being charged again to get the energy back. Energy produced in our communities. Can somebody please explain to me where is the fairness in that? How that looks for those that live in these communities, I'll happily give away.
I thank the right honourable member for giving way. I don't think we should be under any illusion, any of us, that the fact there are so few of us here today does not in fact reflect or minimise the nature of the problem. We have a fundamental unfairness that, if it was in many other aspects of government, would command a big attendance of members. There's something basically wrong here, that a part of the UK is being ripped off when it comes to energy. Now, I would have hoped that the Chancellor and his civil servants, when they were drawing up the budget, I'm sure they took into account what was fair, what was right, and what was not. But has this been factored in? I think we await today with interest. It's apposite that this debate is precisely at this hour that it is, because shortly we'll know, does the Chancellor care about a fundamental unfairness or not?
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution. Of course, we are constituency neighbours, and I agree with the sentiment that's been made. It's a pity that there aren't more members that are in this debate. Having said that, we've actually got the 4 most northerly constituencies that are here. We are the 4 that represent the communities that are most exposed to this. We are the 4, I would suggest, that have 4 of the most rural constituencies in the whole of the United Kingdom. You could add in Naneil and Yanyar, you could add in Argyll to that as well. But it's our constituents that are feeling this. It's our constituents in the main are facing fuel poverty to the extent that we talked about. And I do wonder whether or not those in government actually really recognise what it's like to live in those communities and face the kind of pressures that we face. Now, I've talked about community benefit for transmission, but it's important that there's community benefit for production as well. And again, those on the production side are encouraged to engage in community benefit. But we simply can't leave it to the developers at a whim to determine whether or not there's going to be community benefit. It must be mandatory. It must be in legislation. The Highlands and Islands produce enough energy to power nearly 6 times as many homes as there are in the Highlands, even before the scale investment that we're talking about. And of course, being a windy and a wet region makes us an attractive option for developers, but there must be that payback for communities. In the Highlands and Islands, we are exposed to the effects of climate change. In general, it is an outdoor lifestyle. Crofting and fishing still provide the backbone to economic activity, and those exposed to such activities are exposed to what climate change is bringing. And anyone that has been engaged in crofting can tell you about how difficult it is over the winter months, where you increasingly, from personal experience, sink into the mud because it is just so relentlessly wet. That is the effect that climate change is having on us. It is perhaps therefore of little surprise in general that those that live in such places as Roskillie and Lochaber do support green energy initiatives, and increasingly there is concern that rising production produces little direct benefit from communities from that right to produce. That is why we have this issue of the broken UK energy market. And of course, let's not forget, when we talk about the increase in pricing over the last 2 years, that is largely because electricity prices are tied to gas prices. And yet, it's been talked about earlier in this debate, in the main, people that live in the Highlands and Islands are off-grid. We don't consume gas as part of our energy mix. Yet Highlanders are paying the price for others' dependence on gas. And it's simply unfair that Scotland, that produces enough affordable renewable energy for all domestic consumption, must pay higher prices because other parts of the United Kingdom are more reliant on more expensive gas. In energy-rich Scotland, consumers are in fuel poverty because of the broken UK energy market. Let me point out that those in Scotland are paying a price for being in the United Kingdom. So much for the broad shoulders of the United Kingdom. So much for the union dividend. There is no union dividend. It is a financial penalty, and we in Scotland all pay the price. When we put this in a wider context, the value in today's prices of tax from North Sea oil to the UK Exchequer is more than £400 billion. Our legacy from that bounty of North Sea oil has been squandered, and we've been locked out of the benefit now from Scotland's green energy production. The phrase is often used, Scotland has the energy, but we don't have the power. It is an absolute scandal that we produce the energy, and yet so many of our people are living in fuel poverty. That, Mr. Chairman, is the price of Westminster's control of Scotland's natural resources. Highlanders and Islanders suffering fuel poverty from a broken energy market, and the blame lies fairly and squarely in this place being able to act in the appropriate manner to defend the interests of our constituents.
Thank you very much. Opposition spokesperson, Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Paisley. A pleasure as always to see you in the chair, and I thank the honourable member for bringing this debate, and indeed all four members for taking part and highlighting the specific circumstances which mean that fuel poverty is even more of an issue in their constituencies than in the rest of the UK. And I say that, I mean, we know that overall the average fuel poverty gap has increased by 66% between 2020 to 2023. We know that 3 million people are in debt to their energy providers. We know that the government is struggling to roll out its home insulation scheme. Indeed, we saw figures the other day that said in the first 8 months of the Great British Insulation Scheme, only 2,900 houses had benefited from measures that were meant to benefit 300,000. And obviously in areas like the honourable members home insulation represents even more of a challenge, partly because of the nature of the homes themselves, the older buildings that are difficult to retrofit, but also because there's a much smaller retrofit skills market, and the scattered nature of the housing, the isolation, means that the economies of scale that you would get from rolling out an insulation scheme would be far more difficult to implement. So in some ways they would be, unless local skills can be mobilised in local finance, they are unlikely to be first in the queue to benefit from national schemes. I think all the honourable members, as I said, spoke very eloquently, partly about the conditions which mean that fuel poverty is more of an issue, the longer, darker nights, the cold, the rain that comes straight at you, as I think the honourable member for Orkney and Shetlands described, and the honourable member from Inverness said that a third of people are living in fuel poverty and a fifth in extreme poverty. I think one of the things that I'm trying to grapple with is, it's one thing, with the whole debate about prepayment meters, we know about forced disconnection when people simply can't afford to carry on paying for their electricity. What is more difficult to ascertain is the extent to which people are not having to go to those extremes, but living in very, very cold conditions because they've cut back on paying bills. And we do know that when there is energy bill support and when prices come down, actually their energy use will go up, which implies that they were using less energy than they actually needed to keep themselves warm. And I thought the point that was made about the impact on health for children, for older people, for people with disabilities. Again, we know people with disabilities have higher energy costs.
Very grateful for the member for making that point and underlining that point in terms of the fact that there are big impacts on health, but also the point that where there is a rebate, where there is some funding to actually help people it does have a measurable impact. And the whole point of this proposal on the Highland Energy rebate is actually to put that into place. So I think it's an excellent point to underline. Grateful she's brought that to the table today.
Yeah, and I would say we do need to look at this in the round in terms of, I know that I think the Minister will hopefully enlighten us a bit more about Ofgem did a call for input on standing charges, which I think closed the end of January. As far as I know, we haven't seen the outcome published from that, but I think it's for the Minister to give us some more details about that balance between standing charges, unit prices, social tariff indeed, the discussions about that. But that's certainly all things that we are looking at. As the members said, the fact that the Highlands and Islands have a lack of access to the gas grid means that they're in a particularly difficult situation. I know the figure was mentioned that 62% of properties were off the gas grid in mainland Scotland. I think that's the figure I've got here. But in some places, they're almost entirely off-grid, as I think the member said. This obviously leads to significantly higher costs because it's often oil that's used as a fuel or entirely electric. And again, the point about decoupling from gas prices is very much something that we have taken on board. But it does mean that they don't benefit immediately when those wholesale prices do come down. I've got figures here from is it Loch Sky Housing Association. They say that households in the area pay an additional £1,000 a year on energy bills compared to an average sized home in the rest of Scotland, which amounts to a 76% premium. So, yeah, this is just one figure that illustrates the problem there. The point was very well made that Scotland is home to a huge amount of new energy old and new generation energy generation. And as I think it was the honourable member speaking from the front bench said, just where's the benefit for Scotland from this? I was reading through a report from Changeworks on fuel poverty in the region in advance of this debate, and there was a quote from an energy advisor that really stood out. It said the annoyance of being a 321% net generator of green electricity to the rest of the UK, all from renewables, yet we have no access to the polluting fuel, which is mains gas, and the price of energy is 4 times the cost. So again, we know that renewable energy is going to be way cheaper than fossil fuels, and it's one of the reasons why Labour's committed to the Clean Power by 2030 mission, because we know that will help bring down energy prices. But I can appreciate how absolutely galling it is to be somewhere where so much, I think the honourable member talked about a renaissance, an economic renaissance for the Highlands and Islands linked to renewable energy, and yet you'll be last in the queue to actually benefit from that. So we absolutely need to tackle that unfairness. I would question, and I don't know if anyone wants to intervene in me this, but my understanding is still that the SNP is opposed to a windfall tax. Our proposal, and it's telling that, we do have this debate today with the budget. I hope that we see firm action from the Chancellor on tackling fuel poverty and recognising many of these unfairnesses that have been raised. There is some talk. I think we have heard most of the budget actually already, which isn't normally the case. But I think there is some talk about movement on a windfall tax on oil and gas. Labour is calling for an increase in the rate to 78% on the energy profits levy. And so if I just finish outlining what we say, and extending the sunset clause to 2029, which would raise billions of pounds for the green transition, cutting household energy bills in the process.
I apologise if I got it wrong, but I thought the member was inviting an intervention on that subject.
But I just wanted to sort of get my bit in first, otherwise I'd lose track. Sorry.
The point, I think, and I have to underline it again and again in this debate, and I think she understands this, is there is already a windfall tax and other taxes coming from the Highlands and Islands just now through renewable energy, and we're getting nothing back. So we're already seeing that effect of money being taken out and not going back into the pockets of consumers who are being punished in this way.
Yeah, I think probably because just to do justice to the issues that the honourable members are raising, I won't go down that path of sort of having an argument about the windfall tax, because I think we do want to focus specifically on the fuel poverty in the constituency. I would reiterate, though, that we... Sorry, yeah.
Lady Ashley did raise the issue of windfall tax. This issue doesn't want to debate it. It's rather perverse. But let me try and help her a bit. Because what happened over the course of the last 2 years was that oil prices rose to extraordinary levels. And as a result of that, there were excess profits made by many oil production companies. And what we saw over the last 2 years is companies engaging in pretty large-scale share buybacks. Now, if you think about that, it's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward. That is, in effect, a return of capital to shareholders, but it's untaxed. The opportunity was missed by the Labour opposition and the government to recognise the one-off nature in that, and you could have had, on a one-off basis, a tax on share buybacks, and that could have gone to alleviate the impact of higher energy prices, but both the government and the opposition missed it.
Well, I think we've been calling for a windfall tax for quite some time, and also challenging the generosity of the investment allowance that goes to oil and gas companies, which I think is 91p in the pound. But as I said, not least because my voice seems to be sort of slightly failing me, let's keep to the topic for... Order. Yeah, and if I can start to draw my remarks to a close. I think one of the things that has come out of this, though, in terms of the links to the huge potential of Scotland for renewable energy generation, is that need for a place-based approach where people feel that they are part of the transition and actually directly benefit from it. And as I said, it's particularly galling when Scotland is responsible for so much of the new renewable energy generation that it is not benefiting. And in some ways, it should be benefiting more than other parts of the country, which because they are doing they're doing the generation. And if you look at what Joe Biden's done with the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, very much a place-based approach to that green transition, where areas, I think about 70% of the investment's gone into Texas, which is obviously traditionally an oil-producing state, but they've been very keen to embrace that green transition because they know that it will be people in their state that benefit not just from the jobs, but from a transition, community benefits as well. And Labour, in its local power plan, is very much looking at, it's partly about community energy generation and how they can directly benefit from the renewals serving their needs, but it's also an element of being lifted up as a result of the contribution they're making to the rest of the country. So I'll finish, Mr Paisley, just by asking the Minister... I suspect she's going to say that she can't say anything about what's been announced in the budget today, but I would like some reassurance that she recognises the geographical disparities where some parts of the country are harder hit by fuel poverty. So there's the overarching need to tackle fuel poverty across the UK, and we know that millions of people are affected by that. But if she could say something about the geographical disparity, but also give some indication of where the government is in looking at the fairness in pricing, the impact of standing charges versus unit prices, perhaps something on the prepayment meter as well. Look forward to hearing from her.
Thank you. Minister Soloway.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Paisley, and it's a great pleasure to be here under your chairmanship. And I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey for securing this incredibly important debate, and also for other members for being here. And although we are a small group, I would like to say very powerfully made cases, so thank you for that. Let me try and cover the main issues, and I'll go through them one by one, if I may. So first of all, to come to the standing charges, because that's the thread that has been going through all of the debate today. And the Honourable Member made a powerful point around the standing charges for residents in the Highlands and Islands and saying that they are too high. And as honourable members will probably know, the setting of standing charges associated with each tariff is a commercial matter for suppliers. And suppliers do have a flexibility to structure those tariffs. However, as mentioned, Ofgem have launched a call for input and standing charges, which rightly, as the honourable member mentioned, closed in January. And so far, we've had over 40,000 responses to that, and looking at how it is applied to energy bills and what alternatives should be considered. And Ofgem is currently analysing those responses and will publish in due course. I would just like to make a couple of points on that, though, because it should be noted that suppliers can offer low or no standing charges. And as a wholesale energy prices are coming down, competition is coming back to the market where consumers can access different tariffs. But also to say that once these announcements, once the findings have been all put together, of course, I'm very happy to get together and discuss further how we can use those findings. I recognise also that the price for standing charges for Highland and Island households is an important issue for all of the members, and it would be useful to discuss this in more depth on an ongoing basis. And I want to reassure members, and it was pointed out the influence in terms of discussing these matters with Ofgem. I want to assure all members that I have been putting pressure on Ofgem to address all of these important issues. And also to ensure, of course.
I'm grateful to the Minister, and as has been described earlier, she's always very thoughtful and considerate about some of these issues that she wants to take back. But people do need action in the Highlands and Islands. And, you know, I think I hear in what she's saying that she agrees with the principle that this is fundamentally wrong, that people in the Highlands and Islands are paying more in this way. Is that indeed what she's saying? And is she determined to take forward that injustice and get something done about it with Ofgem?
Minister?
Thank you. I think the point that I'm actually making is the fact that we are looking at the standing charges, which is the one thread that's been going through everybody's comments today and speeches. And we need to do this to make sure that the standing charges are fair. Now, there will be, we don't know what the findings are, but I suspect amongst 40,000, I think it's probably nearer 44,000 responses that we've had, there are going to be lots of things that we need to take into account and looking at how we adjust those standing charges. But of course,
you know, I have to say respectfully to the Minister, this is about fairness, and it's about what should be a universal market. We cannot have people that are being penalised to the extent they are, and it's simply a matter for the government to say to Ofgem that this is not right, that there should be a universal market. People should not be penalised on the basis of where we live. It's a simple question, and the government ought to provide leadership on this.
Minister?
well, to give assurance again, that's exactly, I think, what I'm saying is that I have been tasking Ofgem to have a look at this, that we are looking at the standard. We are waiting for the consultation to come through, and once we have all of those responses and looked at them, I am very, very happy to welcome views on those findings. I'd like to come on to the transmission and distribution charges as well. Think about the electricity network charges are the costs that users pay to connect to and use electricity networks. And these are charged to suppliers and generators, and so eventually these costs are passed on to consumers in their energy bills, some of which is reflected in their standing charges. And Ofgem, as an independent regulator, is responsible for setting the electricity network methodology, and government officials are working closely with the regulator to understand these charges. But the electricity network charges must be cost reflective, so those who pay them are charged in a way that reflects the cost that they are placing on the network. And so transmission charges are based on the costs that different users impose on the transmission by connecting to different locations. And this means that there are higher charges for those who use a network, resulting in longer distances of electricity transmission. And as Scotland, and as the honourable members will know, is a net exporter of electricity, transmission costs for Scottish consumers are lower than their counterparts in England and Wales. However, of course I will.
The Minister describes locational charging, which in the days of generating electricity from hydrocarbons made a degree of sense because there is that element of transmission loss. So you want to encourage transmission closer to the point of consumption. As we move to renewables, that argument simply doesn't stand anymore because you're not wasting a non-renewable resource in order to generate and then transmit your electricity. Why is that not being changed?
Minister?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and of course these are the kind of things that we are working through as we move towards the net zero challenge. I would also like to acknowledge quite rightly that the Honourable members have been talking about the geographical challenges of electricity supply in northern Scotland, such as its size, poor weather conditions, sparse population, mountainous terrain and supplying multiple islands means that inevitably the cost of distribution are much higher than other Great British regions. And they've made the point very clearly, Mr Paisley. Also to acknowledge that the Highlands and Islands produce a high level of renewable electricity, but this doesn't remove the challenges of distributing the electricity at the moment. But as I said, we clearly will be looking at that in the future. Also want to note that the Hydro Benefit Replacement Scheme, and this scheme provides natural annual assistance for around £112 million to reduce distribution charges for domestic and non-domestic consumers in the region, equating to a reduction of around £60 annually per household. I'd like to just move on to energy prices. Of course, yes.
Well, no, I'm going to make this intervention because she talks about that £60. You know, it literally doesn't touch the sides of the bills that we're talking about here, and for those people that are affected. I know she knows this because I've said this to her before. With it, what we need is you know, an overhaul, a rebate that actually makes sense for people, that has an impact on their bills, and that's exactly what this debate is about getting a Highland energy rebate. If they want to use that as a basis for doing this, then I think that's something that may be workable. But I hope she'll take away the fact that whilst, you know, has been said, every little does help in a way, it really doesn't touch the sides of those people who are suffering this injustice.
Thank you, Mr Paisley. And the Honourable Member is right, having had made this point very clearly on several occasions. And of course, I am prepared to discuss more fully the Highland Energy Rebate paper that I have been sent. Moving on to energy prices and support. Despite the rise of standing charges, energy prices have fallen significantly since the winter of 22-23, with quarter two 2024 price cap of 1,690 being 60% lower compared to quarter one 2023 price cap peak. And it's important to note that the government did react really quickly to support households last winter, with around £40 billion being delivered to support households and businesses. And this was an average of £1,500 per household between October 22 and June 23. And also we've delivered £40 billion to support households and businesses last winter, with a typical household receiving a £1,500 support between October 22 to June 2023. As noted, many Highlands and Islands households off the gas grid and so have also benefited from the £200 alternative fuel payment schemes. Despite the fall in energy prices compared to the winter of 22-23, the government has also continued to support households, and we're delivering a package support worth £104 billion or £3,700 per household on average across 2022 to 2025. Just like to move on to debt, which is an incredibly important issue that we are challenged with at the moment. And whilst we're doing a lot to help households, we know that some have fallen into energy debt. And we want to support these households and to ensure that consumers do not fall into more debt or further debt. Last year, Energy UK announced a voluntary debt commitment, with 14 energy suppliers announcing their collective commitment to go above and beyond current licensing conditions to help households and with their energy bill debt. These energy suppliers will aim to provide immediate assistance to those in debt, as well as arming people with knowledge and resources to empower them to manage their bills more effectively. For assurance, Mr Paisley, I regularly meet with stakeholders such as the Citizens' Advice to discuss what could be done to address the issue of consumer debt. And of course, I will welcome further input from members on this issue at a later date, whenever it's... Yeah.
Minister, for giving way. I met with some academics who are doing some research into debt levels this week, and as I understand it, the average would be about £1,000 per household, but I don't know to what extent, you know, to what extent there are people that are only like £100, £200 in debt, and other people that might even be in five-figure worth of debt. And I wondered if the government did have an analysis of that and had figures that perhaps she could either share with me or put in the House of Commons library.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Paisley. And it is really important, of course, that we do consider the different levels of debts. It's quite complex to get those figures because they are supplier figures. And indeed, I have tried to push to see if we can get a flavour for them. But we don't have all of those figures because it is very complex. And of course, it is suppliers, different suppliers who have those figures as well. One of the things that I would advise households struggling with their bills is to speak to their supplier before they go into debt, if possible, to receive help and support as soon as possible. We've talked about prepayment meters, and prepayment meters, of course, Mr Paisley, can be a useful tool for consumers to manage their budgets and for energy suppliers to manage debt. However, it is important that the rules around their use are sufficient to protect consumers and are properly enforced, and involuntary installations should only be used as a last resort. Ofgem have strengthened their licence conditions for suppliers to conduct involuntary prepayment meter installations with exemptions for place for households with vulnerable individuals, such as people who are over 75 or who have children under the age of 2. I'd just like to move on to a couple of further points. The government has already committed to supporting households past April 2024, and in the autumn statement, though I can't comment on today's budget, obviously, we announced the biggest increase to the living wage and increase to benefits of 6.7%. And earlier this year, we cut national insurance for 27 million people, which is worth £450 for the average worker. As members have noted, the autumn statement, we also committed to giving communities living nearest to electricity transmission infrastructure up to £1,000 off their electricity bills for the next 10 years. And this will apply across England, Wales and Scotland and Highlands and Islands as well, and they may be able to benefit from the scheme. And we will publish guidance this year on the wider benefits for local projects and provide an update on the electricity bill discount scheme. As the honourable members have mentioned, many households in the Highlands and Islands are on the off the gas grid, which means they rely more on electricity. And I also understand that many Highlands and Islands residents will use more energy and subsequently pay more for their energy bills due to the inclement weather, colder temperatures and poor insulation, but also due to having older, larger properties which are harder to heat. To address this, the government has already introduced several domestic energy efficient schemes for all households in Great Britain to help lower bills and reach net zero targets. As an example, the Great British Insulation Scheme is delivering low-cost and free insulation to at least efficient homes in lower council tax bands, including many vulnerable households, and the scheme will run until March 26 with a value of £1 billion. Since it was launched in January 2013, ECO has delivered around 3.8 million measures in approximately 2.5 million homes. And across eco schemes, around 31,600 measures have been delivered to 23,100 households in local authority areas in the Scottish Highlands and Islands since 2013. As the honourable members will know, fuel poverty is devolved with the Scottish Government responsible for fuel poverty in Scotland. However, the Energy Company Obligation and the Great British Insulation Scheme I mentioned earlier are delivering energy-efficient measures to the least efficient and low-income homes in Scotland. And we're currently reviewing the fuel poverty strategy for England and will engage with devolved administrations as part of this process. Mr Paisley, I understand this is a complex matter and one which is very important to all of the honourable members here, and thank them for bringing this important matter to the debate. I would be happy to, of course, meet people on further to this particular discussion. But also, I just wanted to mention, finally, the point that is made around lived experiences and impact on health. And having been brought up in a household that was fuel poor, I do know what it's like. I do know the impact that it can have on your health, especially as my mum did actually suffer with COPD, and we found it incredibly difficult to obviously manage all of those challenges. So my commitment is to do the very best that I can to support all of those energy-poor households. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I will give the member a couple of minutes to wind up. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr Paisley, for that. And can I thank the members that have taken part in the debate. I think we've had a clear exposition of the issue this morning, and to the Labour front bench and to the Minister for being so open in terms of looking at discussions and understanding the issue. Nobody in this room has disagreed that there is an injustice happening to the people of the Highlands and Islands, that they are suffering unduly under the circumstances for the prices that they pay for their electricity. And, you know, I more than anyone welcome the idea of further discussions with the Minister. But I would also say that along with the empathy that she obviously is displaying, you know, there is a need for action. And, you know, and I think the issue of electricity pricing for the Highlands and Islands, for the issue of the unregulated off-gas grid customers has been going on for years and years, decades indeed. And, you know, they need action now because this is a severe and urgent problem, and I'd urge that those discussions to be quick and meaningful, and for to use our best offices to give the most serious shove to Ofgem to tackle this issue with it. As we've said during the debate, the Highlands and Islands produces 6% of the electricity, but has only 4.4% of the population across the nations of the UK. They have higher than average bills, yet we get the highest levels of fuel and extreme poverty. The Hydro Benefit Replacement Scheme doesn't do the job that it was supposed to do. It needs to be updated, and there is an opportunity to do that by combining this with the Chancellor's scheme to get a rebate that goes directly back to those people who are affected in this issue in the Highlands and Islands. And I hope that the Minister will take that away, as she said she will do, for further discussions. But again, I stress the need for some urgent action to solve this issue, and I'll be very happy to meet with her in future in order to see what we can do to get some real action for this issue. Thank you.
Is that the House has considered the introduction of energy rebates for the Highlands and Islands. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. We will start the next debate as soon as the member arrives. Until then, we will stand suspended.